It was a warm summer evening on June 19th, 1986, in Durango, Colorado. The kind of night that should have been about fun, laughter, and maybe a little harmless mischief. But for four teenagers, it turned into something much darker, a night they'd never be able to forget. Just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, the group decided to explore Bell Cavern, an old abandoned mine locals called Old Weaver Mine. Everyone in town knew it was dangerous with its crumbling walls and tight, twisting tunnels. But for 17-year-old Thad Shear, that was exactly why he wanted to go. He loved a challenge, especially one that came with a rush of adrenaline. By 8:30 p.m., they were deep inside the cave, about 200 feet from the entrance. The further they went, the colder and darker it got. The air felt heavy and damp, like the cave itself was breathing down their necks. They crawled over jagged rocks, squeezed through narrow gaps, and ducked under low ceilings, their nerves growing tighter with every step. Then, Thad spotted something that made his heart race, a narrow vertical shaft, barely 18 inches wide, disappearing into complete darkness. It was just big enough for someone daring, or maybe reckless, to climb down and see what was below. His friends tried to talk him out of it. "Thad, this is a bad idea," one of them said, their voice shaky. But Thad just flashed his trademark grin, brushing off their worries. "I'll be fine," he said, his confidence unshaken. Before anyone could stop him, he started climbing down. The shaft was tight, the rocks wet and loose. Thad pressed his arms and legs against the walls, inching his way down, his breathing loud and uneven in the cramped space. About 10 feet down, everything went wrong. The rocks beneath Thad shifted suddenly, and his foot slipped. His body twisted awkwardly, and with a sickening scrape of stone against stone, he got stuck, completely wedged in the narrow shaft. He pushed against the walls, trying to free himself, but it was no use. The more he struggled, the tighter the shaft seemed to hold him. His breathing became fast and shallow, the sound echoing up to his friends above. In less than a minute, he passed out, his body going still. One of his friends dropped to the edge of the shaft, shouting his name over and over. "Thad! Thad, can you hear me?" But there was no response, only silence from the darkness below. One of the group members knew they had to act fast. Without a second thought, he turned and ran through the maze-like cave, scrambling over rocks and squeezing through tight spaces. Finally, he burst out into the cool night air and sprinted to find a phone. It was almost 10 p.m. when he reached the La Plata County Sheriff's Office, breathless and desperate for help. Back in the cave, Thad's situation was getting worse by the minute. Stuck in the narrow shaft, he couldn't move, and the air around him was running out. The cave seemed to be crushing him, its cold, damp walls closing in. He was unconscious, his body limp, and the freezing temperature was making things even more dangerous. His friends could only wait in the heavy, suffocating silence, their flashlights flickering as they stared helplessly at Thad's motionless body trapped below. By 2 a.m., rescue teams from Leadville, Ouray, and Silverton arrived, ready for what would become one of the most challenging operations of their careers. They brought compressed air drills, hammers, and oxygen tanks, knowing every second mattered. But getting to Thad was no easy task. The cave was a maze of tight, twisting passages, some so narrow that rescuers had to crawl on their stomachs, dragging their heavy gear behind them. It was slow, exhausting work, but they pushed forward, determined to save him. At 3 a.m., Keith D., a 29-year-old veteran rescuer, tried to create a new opening near the shaft where Thad was trapped. The idea was to make another way to reach him. But the rocks were unstable, crumbling under the pressure of his tools. Then, disaster struck. The ground beneath Keith gave way. There were shouts of panic as he slipped, falling down the same vertical shaft Thad was stuck in. Then came the awful thud as he landed right on top of Thad, pushing him even deeper into the tight space. The rescue team was stunned. Keith had hit his head during the fall and was now unconscious. The narrow shaft, already a deadly trap, now held two bodies. It was a nightmare no one had imagined, a rescuer needing to be rescued. Keith's weight pressed down on Thad, making the already dangerous situation even worse. The tight space felt like a coffin, with Keith lying unconscious and Thad still unresponsive beneath him. In rescue missions, it's rare for the rescuers to end up in danger themselves, but this cave was different. It didn't care who you were or how experienced you were. What started as a mission to save Thad had turned into a desperate fight to save 2 lives. The team's plan was thrown into chaos, and every second felt like a battle against the cave itself. They didn't waste a moment. Oxygen tanks were rushed into the cave, passed carefully through the tight, freezing tunnels. Every movement was slow and deliberate, like trying to thread a needle in the dark. Tubes and masks were lowered into the shaft, the rescuers shouting instructions as they worked to get them onto Keith and Thad. Miraculously, the oxygen started to work. Keith was the first to stir, groaning in pain, his head wobbling weakly. Moments later, Thad's eyes flickered open. He looked dazed, his face pale and sweaty as he gasped for air. For a brief moment, the rescuers felt a flicker of hope. Both men were alive, but they were in bad shape. The rescuers kept working, hammering and drilling to widen the shaft without causing more collapses. The tight space and freezing cold wore them down, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Thad and Keith were running out of time. By the time the sun began to rise, they had finally widened the shaft enough to try pulling them out. Nearly 12 hours had passed since Thad first got trapped. Keith was the first to be pulled out. His body was limp, his face twisted in pain. Medics rushed him to the surface, where they discovered he had a broken neck and fluid in his lungs. He was barely conscious, clinging to life by a thread. Thad came next. His body shook violently, weakened by the cold and the crushing pressure of being trapped for so long. The rescuers moved him carefully through the rough opening, taking their time to avoid causing more harm. When he finally emerged at 9:30 a.m., he was too weak to speak, his face pale as a sheet. Both men were alive, but the rescue had left everyone drained. The rescuers, bruised and exhausted, sat in silence, trying to process how close they had come to disaster. This mission would stay with them forever, a stark reminder of how quickly a routine job can turn into a nightmare. Keith needed serious medical care, and his recovery would be long and difficult. Thad, though deeply shaken, had made it through the terrible night thanks to the rescue team's tireless efforts. Nestled deep within the rugged landscapes of Norway's Rana municipality lies Plura, the deepest and most extensive cave system in northern Europe. This underwater labyrinth is both a siren's call and a death trap for thrill-seeking cave divers from around the world. Its allure lies in the beauty of its vibrant, submerged caves. Yet beneath its surface, the Plura cave system hides a treacherous path that has claimed more than its fair share of lives, particularly during Norway's harsh winters when the surface of Lake Plura freezes over, encasing the entrance in a formidable barrier of ice. On February 6, 2014, 5 Finnish divers, seasoned veterans of the sport, embarked on a mission that would test their courage, skill, and resolve to the utmost limits. These men were not newcomers to the dangers of cave diving. They had faced the perils of the deep before, navigating through some of the most challenging underwater passages in Europe. However, this dive was different. It was to be the culmination of their experiences, pushing the boundaries of human endurance and testing the very limits of what was possible beneath the earth. Their destination was Steinalflaga, a remote and perilous cave within the Plura system, accessed only through a network of narrow underwater tunnels. The dive was planned to take approximately 5 hours, with the men descending to depths exceeding 130 meters, far beyond the comfort zone of even the most experienced cave divers. For most amateur divers, an hour at 30 meters would be considered a significant achievement. But for these 5 men, this dive was an opportunity to achieve something extraordinary, something few others could claim. The expedition began in the early morning hours, with the men cutting a triangular hole in the ice covering Lake Plura. They slipped into the icy depths, encased in waterproof dry suits and laden with advanced diving equipment designed to withstand the extreme pressures and temperatures they would encounter. From the moment they entered the water, the risks were evident. The deeper they dove, the colder and darker the water became, the tunnels narrowing to the point where even a slight mistake could mean disaster. Jagged rocks protruding from the cave walls threatened to tear through their suits and equipment, while the ever-present danger of hypercapnia, a potentially deadly buildup of carbon dioxide, loomed large over the entire expedition. Patrick Grankvist led the group, a seasoned diver who, along with 2 others, had discovered the passage between Plura and Steinlaflaga the previous year. His close friend, Jari Hinen, accompanied him, attempting the full traverse for the first time. The dive began smoothly, with the men descending into the inky blackness of the cave, their path illuminated only by the beams of their flashlights. But as they reached the deepest section of the cave, 110 meters below the entrance, disaster struck. Grankvist realized that Hinen was no longer behind him. Panic gripped him as he circled back, searching desperately for his friend. When he finally found Hinen, he was trapped in a narrow section of the cave, ensnared by a cord from his diving equipment. Hinen was signaling frantically with his flashlight, the only way he could communicate his distress in the pitch-black water. Grankvist knew the danger his friend was in. Hinen was panicking, his breathing becoming erratic, which meant he was at serious risk of hypercapnia. Grankvist acted quickly, attempting to calm Hinen and offering him a gas cylinder to help reduce the carbon dioxide in his system. But as Hinen tried to switch mouthpieces, tragedy struck. His panic overwhelmed him, and he began to gasp for air, inadvertently inhaling water instead. Grankvist could only watch in horror as his friend drowned before his eyes, his struggles growing weaker until finally he was still. The shock of witnessing his friend's death was overwhelming. But Grankvist knew he had to control his own emotions and breathing to avoid the same fate. He could not afford to panic, not now, not here, deep within the heart of the cave. After a futile attempt to free Hinen's body, he realized he had no choice but to continue towards Steinlaflaga. The journey ahead was fraught with danger. Not only did he have to navigate the treacherous tunnels, but he also faced the risk of decompression sickness, a potentially deadly condition that could strike if he ascended too quickly after spending so much time at such extreme depths. As Grankvist pressed on, the second team of divers, led by Visa Ranin, was following behind. Ranin was the first to encounter Hinen's body, and he was faced with a gut-wrenching decision: turn back or continue. After weighing his options, he chose to press on, but the delay in navigating around the body added several hours to his decompression time. When Ranin finally surfaced, he was in agony, suffering from the early stages of decompression sickness. The pain in his joints, a common symptom of the condition, grew worse with each passing hour, a grim reminder of the dangers they faced in the depths. Meanwhile, the third diver, Jari Uzumaki, was dealing with his own nightmare. Upon discovering Hinen's lifeless body, Uzumaki panicked, his mind overwhelmed by the sight of his dead friend. In his terror, he overloaded his rebreather with carbon dioxide, a mistake that would prove fatal. Despite the efforts of the fifth diver, Kai Kenan, to assist him, Uzumaki could not regain control and drowned just 20 meters from where Hinen's body lay. Kenan, shaken but determined to survive, made the grueling journey back to the starting point, breaking through a thin layer of ice as he finally resurfaced nearly 11 hours after the dive began. All three surviving divers were immediately hospitalized with decompression sickness, their bodies racked with pain from the bends. Local authorities took their statements, and the Plura cave system was temporarily closed to prevent further tragedies. The loss of Hinen and Uzumaki sent shockwaves through the Finnish diving community, and word of the disaster soon reached Sami Pakarinen, a diving instructor and close friend of the deceased, who was teaching in Mexico at the time. Pakarinen spent hours on a Skype call with British cave diver Rick Stanton, a man renowned for his rescue and recovery work in some of the world's most dangerous underwater caves. Stanton had already heard about the accident and was preparing to assist in retrieving the bodies of the two divers. 2 weeks later, he, along with divers John Volin and Jason Mallison, made the arduous journey to Norway to begin the recovery operation. However, the mission proved more challenging than anticipated. The narrow passage where Hinen's body was lodged blocked access to Uzumaki, making it impossible to reach him from the Steinle-Flaga side of the tunnel. The divers considered returning to their point of origin and attempting to dive backward through the system, but the risks were too great. The recovery was called off, and the Norwegian police declared the operation too dangerous to continue. Devastated by the failure, but resolute in his determination, Grankvist made a solemn promise to Hinen's widow. He vowed to bring her husband's body back, no matter the cost. It was an unspoken code among divers. No one gets left behind, not even in death. This was a promise Grankvist intended to keep. Quietly, the surviving divers began planning a second unauthorized recovery mission. They knew that they would be denied permission if they asked, so they kept their preparations secret. On March 22, 2014, a team of 27 divers descended on Plura. This time, the operation was meticulously planned. 2 teams of support divers worked in the shallower areas of the cave, ensuring that the main team had everything they needed for the deep dive. Grankvist, Pekarinen, and Kanan were the ones who would go deep, risking everything to retrieve the bodies of their fallen friends. Volin, still recovering from his own injuries sustained during the previous attempt, managed surface operations, coordinating the efforts of the entire team. The recovery mission was grueling and fraught with danger, but after 3 days, the bodies of Jari Heinen and Jari Uzumaki were finally brought to the surface. The Norwegian police, while pleased that the bodies had been retrieved, made it clear that several rules had been broken in the process. But for the surviving divers, those concerns were secondary to the fulfillment of their vow.